Some sounds don't belong to the night. They belong to something waiting to be found. The wind moved slow through the pines behind Daniel Hayes's cabin, carrying that thin, hollow whisper that always came just before the temperature dropped, the kind of cold that settled into your bones without asking permission. And inside the small wooden structure, where a single oil lamp burned low against the walls, Rex was already awake long before the clock reached 2:17 a.m., his ears lifting first, then his head, then his entire body rising with a quiet tension that felt almost deliberate, as if he had been called by something too distant for human senses to catch. And then it came, the sound that had begun to carve itself into Daniel's nights over the past week, a long, low howl that didn't echo like a call into the wild, but instead pressed outward like a signal trying to reach something unseen, something not in the trees, not in the sky, but somewhere deeper, somewhere closer than it should have been. And Daniel stirred beneath his wool blanket, eyes opening slowly, as if pulled from a place he didn't fully trust anymore, his breath steady but heavy with the kind of fatigue that came from years of carrying silence rather than noise. And he didn't move at first, because men like him learn not to react too quickly, not to sounds, not to instincts, not to memories that sometimes felt more real than the room around them. But Rex howled again, sharper this time, and when Daniel turned his head toward the door, he didn't see the dog staring outside like he expected, didn't see the rigid posture of a hunter sensing movement beyond the walls. Instead, Rex stood near the far corner of the cabin, paws planted firm against the wooden floorboards, his body angled downward, his gaze fixed not at the door, not at the window, but at the ground itself. And something about that stillness, that focus, sent a quiet unease through Daniel's chest that he couldn't explain, not yet, not in words, because he had heard animals react to danger before, had trusted signals like that in places far louder than this, places where missing a sound meant not making it home, and yet this felt different, slower, almost patient, like whatever Rex sensed wasn't passing through but had already been there long before they arrived. Daniel pushed himself up, boots finding the floor with a soft thud, his movements careful, deliberate, the same rhythm he carried from another life, another world where every step had weight. And he crossed the room without speaking, because there was no need for words between them, not after everything they had already been through together. And when he reached Rex, he didn't touch him right away, didn't break the line of sight the dog held with that exact point on the floor, because instinct told him not to interrupt, not yet. And for a moment, the cabin felt smaller than it was, the air heavier, like the space itself was holding its breath. And Daniel followed the angle of Rex's gaze, staring down at the worn boards beneath them, boards that creaked with age and shifted with the seasons, but had never once demanded attention, until now. And Rex let out a softer sound, not quite a howl, not quite a whine, something in between, something that carried a question more than a warning. And Daniel exhaled slowly, his hand finally resting against the side of the dog's neck, feeling the steady warmth beneath the fur, grounding himself in something real, something certain, even as that quiet unease deepened into something harder to ignore, because in that moment, standing in the stillness between night and morning, Daniel realized something he hadn't allowed himself to consider before. Rex wasn't calling out to the darkness beyond the cabin. He was answering something that had been there all along, waiting just beneath their feet. Daniel did not sleep for the rest of the night, not because he was afraid, but because something inside him had shifted, the same way it used to when a signal did not make sense but refused to be ignored. And he sat there on the edge of his bed with his elbows resting on his knees, watching Rex as the dog paced slowly across the same patch of floor, stopping every few seconds to lower his head, ears twitching as if listening to something faint and distant, something layered beneath the quiet of the cabin. And every now and then Rex would press his paw against the wood, not scratching, not digging, just applying pressure as if trying to feel through it. And Daniel found himself counting the silence between those movements without realizing it, the way he once counted seconds between tremors in another place, another life. And after a while he noticed a pattern, not in the sound, because there was no sound he could hear, but in Rex's behavior. A pause, then a shift, then stillness again, repeating in a rhythm that felt too deliberate to dismiss. And that was when Daniel stood up and walked to the far wall where his old gear sat untouched in a canvas bag. The same bag he had not opened in years. Not since the day he decided he was done listening for things that never came back. But now his hands moved without hesitation, pulling out a compact flashlight, a worn multi-tool, and a small folding shovel he had kept more out of habit than intention. And when he turned back toward the center of the room, Rex had stopped moving completely, standing over that same spot with his body rigid, his tail low, his breathing slow and controlled, and his eyes, those steady amber eyes, locked not on Daniel, but on the floor as if waiting for him to understand something that could not be explained. And Daniel stepped closer, crouching down until he was level with the boards, running his fingers along the seams where the planks met, feeling the grain, the slight variations in temperature, the places where the wood had settled over time. And at first it felt like nothing, just old timber shaped by years of weather and weight. But then his palm paused over a narrow section where the wood felt just a fraction cooler, not enough to notice in passing, but enough to stand out when you were looking for it. And he pressed down gently, then harder, and the board gave just slightly under the pressure, not enough to shift, but enough to confirm what his instincts were already beginning to piece together. And Rex let out a low sound again, softer this time, almost relieved, as if the first step had been taken. And Daniel leaned back on his heels, exhaling slowly as he looked around the cabin, taking in the walls, the beams, the floor that had seemed so ordinary just hours before. And he realized something that made his chest tighten in a way he had not felt in years. This place had not just been built, it had been layered, altered, possibly hidden, and whatever was beneath them was not new. It was old, older than his time here, older than the silence he had come looking for. And for a long moment he said nothing, because there are moments when words only make things less clear, and instead, he reached for the multi-tool, sliding the edge carefully into the seam between the boards, applying just enough pressure to test the resistance. And the wood responded with a faint, dry creak, the kind that comes from something that has not been moved in a very long time. And Rex stepped back just slightly, not out of fear, but to give space, to allow the next step to happen. And Daniel paused again, his hand resting on the tool, his breath steady but deeper now, because he understood one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever was beneath that floor had been waiting, and somehow, without knowing how or why, Rex had heard it long before he ever did. The first board did not come loose all at once. It resisted in small, stubborn ways, the wood tightening against the tool as if it had grown used to holding its place for years, maybe decades. And Daniel adjusted his grip, angling the blade more carefully this time, applying slow and even pressure the way he had learned when working through fragile structures where forcing anything too quickly only made things worse. And the cabin answered with a deeper creak, a long, drawn-out sound that seemed to travel through the beams and into the walls, as if the entire place had felt the shift. And Rex stepped back another inch, his body lowering slightly, not afraid, but alert in that quiet, calculating way that came from training and instinct combined. And when the board finally lifted just enough to break its seal, a thin line of darkness appeared beneath it, narrow but undeniable, and a faint draft slipped upward through the gap, cool and steady, carrying with it a smell that did not belong to the present moment, something dry and metallic, like old air that had been sealed away from sunlight for far too long. And Daniel paused again, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition, because he had felt this before, not in a cabin, not in a place meant for living, but in spaces that were hidden, forgotten, spaces that held stories no one had finished telling. And he widened the gap carefully, sliding the board aside inch by inch until there was enough space to see beyond the surface. And when he lowered the beam of his flashlight into the opening, the light did not scatter across loose soil or shallow framing. It dropped deeper than expected, cutting through a vertical space that extended far below the cabin floor. And for a second, Daniel thought it was a trick of the angle. But when he shifted the light slightly, the shape became clearer, straight edges, defined corners, not natural, not accidental, something constructed, something intentional. And Rex let out a low breath behind him, a soft exhale that carried a strange sense of confirmation, as if the dog had been waiting for that exact moment. And Daniel leaned closer, bracing one hand against the remaining boards while he directed the light further down, revealing what looked like the top edge of a metal surface about 4 feet below, weathered but intact. its outline barely visible beneath a layer of dust and time, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. The cabin quiet except for the faint whisper of air rising through the opening. A steady, almost rhythmic flow that did not match the wind outside, and Daniel's mind began to connect pieces he had not even realized he was holding. The way Rex had howled at the same hour each night. The way he had focused on this exact spot. The pattern that had felt too deliberate to ignore. And now this, a hidden space beneath the cabin, sealed but not forgotten, and he shifted his position slightly, angling the light along the edge of the metal surface, searching for any sign of a latch, a hinge, anything that suggested access. And that was when he saw it, a faint line running along one side, almost invisible unless you were looking directly for it, and just beside it, a small circular indentation, worn smooth as if it had once been used repeatedly, and Daniel felt a slow, steady tightening in his chest. Not fear, not even anticipation, but something quieter, something deeper, the feeling of standing at the edge of a truth that had been waiting longer than he had been here, longer than he had been ready to hear it. And behind him, Rex shifted his weight once, then settled again, his eyes never leaving the opening, as if he understood something Daniel was only just beginning to realize, that whatever lay beneath that floor had not called out by accident, and it had not chosen the night without reason. It had waited for someone who would finally listen. Daniel did not rush the next step, because there are moments when moving too quickly can break something that has waited years to be found, and instead he shifted his weight back, studying the opening with a patience that had been carved into him long before this cabin ever existed, his eyes tracing every edge, every shadow the flashlight revealed. And the more he looked, the clearer it became that this was not a random hollow beneath the floor. It was designed, measured, intentional, the kind of work done by someone who understood structure, someone who expected it to last. And Daniel reached for the coil of rope from his bag, testing its strength with a firm pull before anchoring one insecurely around a thick support beam near the wall, the knot tight and practiced, muscle memory guiding his hands without hesitation. And Rex watched every movement closely, his body still but his attention sharp, as if he already knew what came next. And when Daniel returned to the opening, he widened it just enough to allow his shoulders through, carefully removing another board and setting it aside, each motion controlled, respectful, almost as if he were entering a place that demanded quiet rather than force. And then he lowered the flashlight again, letting the beam sweep across the space below, revealing more detail this time. A narrow drop of about 4 feet leading to a solid surface, not dirt, not rock, but a metal platform or hatch, its surface dulled by time but still intact, and along its edges, faint lines suggested seams, joints, the kind that allowed movement if you knew how to find it. And Daniel took a slow breath before gripping the rope and easing himself down into the opening, his boots touching the metal with a soft, hollow sound that echoed slightly upward. And the temperature shifted immediately, cooler, stiller, the air heavier with that same dry, aged scent, and for a moment he simply stood there, crouched beneath the cabin floor, listening, not for noise, but for the absence of it, the kind of silence that feels different from the one above, deeper, older, as if it had settled here long before he arrived. And Rex leaned over the edge above, his head lowered, watching Daniel with that steady, unblinking focus. Not anxious, not uncertain, just present, as if confirming that this was exactly where they were meant to be. And Daniel ran his hand across the surface beneath him, feeling the texture of the metal, the slight ridges where seams met, and then he found it again, that same circular indentation he had seen from above, now clearer in the direct light, positioned near one edge, worn smooth in a way that suggested it had once been used more than once. And he brushed away a thin layer of dust, revealing a faint outline around it, a recessed section shaped almost like a handle, but without anything to grip. And his mind worked through possibilities, mechanisms, pressure locks, hidden releases, the kind of systems designed to remain unseen unless you knew where to look. And he pressed his fingers gently into the indentation, testing the resistance. And at first nothing happened, the metal holding firm as if it had forgotten its purpose. But then, with just a slight increase in pressure, there was a subtle shift beneath his hand, a muted click that was almost swallowed by the surrounding stillness, and Daniel froze, his breath steady but deeper now, because that sound was unmistakable, not imagined, not accidental. Something inside this structure had responded, and above him, Rex let out a quiet exhale, his ears lifting just slightly. And for the first time since this began, Daniel felt something beyond curiosity, something closer to recognition, because whatever lay beneath this hatch was not just hidden, it was waiting for the right moment to be opened, and somehow, without explanation, that moment had arrived. The sound of the click did not echo loudly, but it carried weight, the kind of quiet confirmation that changes everything once it happens, and Daniel kept his hand in place for a second longer, feeling the slight shift beneath the metal as if the mechanism itself was waking from a long, silent sleep, and then slowly, almost reluctantly, the surface beneath him gave way just enough to create a narrow seam along the edge, a thin line of darkness that had not been there moments before, and a faint breath of air rose through it, cooler than before, deeper, carrying with it a scent that felt older, not unpleasant, just distant, like something preserved rather than abandoned, and Daniel eased his fingers along the seam, testing it carefully, and with steady pressure he pulled upward, and this time the hatch responded, not fully, but enough to lift a fraction of an inch, just enough to confirm that it was meant to open. And above him Rex shifted, his paws scraping lightly against the wooden edge of the opening, not restless, not impatient, but attentive, as if marking each step of the process, and Daniel adjusted his grip, setting his boots firmly against the metal as he pulled again, and the hatch moved further this time, slowly rising with a low, controlled resistance, the kind that comes from weight rather than damage, and as it opened, the darkness below seemed to deepen, not because it was empty, but because it held space, a larger chamber hidden beneath the cabin, and Daniel paused with the hatch partially lifted, his breath steady but deliberate, because once it opened fully, there would be no returning to not knowing, and he lowered the flashlight into the gap, letting the beam stretch into the space below, and what it revealed was not chaos, not collapse, but structure, clean lines, reinforced walls, a narrow stairway descending further down, its steps metal and intact, leading into a room that had been sealed away with intention, and for a long moment Daniel said nothing, because there are places that demand silence when they are first discovered, and this was one of them, and Rex let out a soft sound above, not a howl this time, not even a whine, just a low breath that carried a sense of calm, as if the search had reached its turning point, and Daniel lifted the hatch a little higher, bracing it carefully so it would not fall, and the air that rose from below felt steady, unmoving, untouched by wind or weather, and he lowered himself slightly, angling the light along the walls, noticing details that confirmed what his instincts had already told him. This was not a natural space. It was built with purpose, reinforced with care, something meant to endure time rather than be forgotten by it. And then, just at the edge of the light, something caught his attention, a faint reflection, small but distinct, coming from deeper within the room, not moving, not flickering, just there, waiting to be seen. And Daniel narrowed his focus, adjusting the angle of the flashlight, trying to bring it into clearer view. And as the beam settled, the reflection resolved into something more defined, not a random surface, but an object, positioned deliberately within the space, something that had been left behind or placed with intention. And Daniel felt that same quiet tightening in his chest again, not fear, not uncertainty, but recognition, because whatever this place was, it had not been built without reason, and whatever waited below had not been waiting without purpose, and above him, Rex remained still, watching, listening, as if he had already known that this moment would come, long before Daniel ever opened the floor. Daniel lowered himself fully through the opening, his boots settling onto the metal surface with a soft, hollow tone that seemed to travel farther than it should have, as if the space below carried sound differently, more deliberately, and he steadied himself before releasing the rope, letting his eyes adjust to the deeper darkness, while the narrow beam of his flashlight guided his view step by step. And the stairway ahead revealed itself more clearly now, descending at a gentle angle for perhaps 10 feet before turning slightly out of sight. The metal steps intact, untouched by rust in the way exposed structures often were, suggesting that whatever this place was, it had been sealed well, protected from the slow erosion of time, and Daniel moved forward with measured steps, each one placed carefully, not out of fear, but out of respect for a space that had not been disturbed in years. And above him, Rex remained at the opening, watching, his silhouette framed against the dim light of the cabin, his ears forward, his presence steady, like an anchor between what was known and what was unfolding below. And as Daniel reached the bottom of the steps, the air shifted again, not colder this time, but still, almost unmoving, carrying a faint hum that was not quite sound but not entirely silence either, something subtle enough that it could be dismissed if one was not listening for it. And Daniel paused, tilting his head slightly, letting his senses adjust the way they once had in environments where the smallest detail mattered. And there it was again, faint, rhythmic, not mechanical, not natural, something in between, like a pattern waiting to be recognized, and he followed it instinctively, stepping into the chamber beyond the stairway, where the flashlight revealed a room larger than he expected, perhaps 12 by 12 feet, its walls reinforced with metal panels. The floor clean except for a thin layer of dust that had settled evenly over time, undisturbed, and in the center of the room, exactly where the reflection had first caught his attention, stood a small structure, not a table, not quite a pedestal, but something built to hold or protect what rested on top of it. And Daniel approached slowly, the beam of light narrowing as his focus sharpened, and as he drew closer, the object came into view, a compact metal box, no larger than a shoebox. Its surface smooth but marked by faint lines that suggested careful craftsmanship rather than mass production, and on its top, etched lightly into the metal, was a simple symbol, one Daniel did not recognize immediately but felt strangely familiar, as if it belonged to a language or system he had once known but could no longer fully recall, and the faint hum he had noticed earlier seemed stronger here, not louder, but more defined, as if it originated from within or around the box itself. And Daniel crouched slightly, lowering the flashlight to examine it more closely, his hand hovering just above the surface without touching it, because something told him that this was not just an object left behind, it was something placed with intention, something meant to be found at the right time. And above, Rex shifted again, a soft sound escaping him. Not urgent, not warning, but acknowledging, and Daniel exhaled slowly, his gaze steady, because in that quiet moment, standing in a room that had been hidden beneath his own feet, he understood something with a clarity that did not need explanation. This was not about what had been buried, it was about what had been waiting, and somehow, Rex had heard it long before the world above ever noticed. Daniel did not reach for the box immediately, because there are moments when touching something too soon can close a door that has only just begun to open, and instead he remained crouched there in the quiet, the beam of the flashlight steady but narrow as it traced the edges of the object, taking in every detail with the same patience that had once kept him alive in places where certainty never came quickly. And the symbol etched into the surface began to settle into his memory, not as something he recognized fully, but as something that belonged to a system of intention rather than decoration. Simple lines arranged with purpose, like a mark left behind for someone who would understand when the time was right. And the faint hum continued, steady and rhythmic, not loud enough to fill the room, but present enough that it could not be ignored. And Daniel shifted slightly, lowering himself closer to the floor so he could listen more carefully, his head tilting just a fraction as he let the sound settle around him. And there was something familiar about it now, not in tone, but in timing, the spacing between each pulse, consistent, deliberate, and before he even realized it, his mind had begun counting again, the way it once did in another place, another mission, where time was measured. Not in minutes, but in patterns. And he inhaled slowly, steadying himself as the realization formed, because the rhythm was not random, it was structured, like a signal, not meant to be heard by everyone, but waiting for someone who would recognize it. And above him, Rex let out a soft, low sound, almost like an answer, and Daniel glanced upward instinctively, meeting the dog's gaze for a brief second. And in that moment, there was no confusion between them, no uncertainty, just a quiet understanding that this was not coincidence. And Daniel returned his attention to the box, his hand hovering closer now, the distance between instinct and action narrowing with each passing second. And finally, with a slow and deliberate motion, He placed his palm gently against the metal surface, expecting resistance, coldness, something distant, but instead what he felt was steady, almost neutral, as if the object had settled into the space rather than fought against it, and the hum shifted. Ever so slightly beneath his touch, not louder, not stronger, but different, like a response rather than a reaction, and Daniel held his hand there, his breath controlled, his focus absolute, because he understood something now that could not be explained through logic alone. This was not just an object left behind. It was something that recognized presence, something that responded to being found. And he traced his fingers lightly along the edge, searching for a seam, a latch, anything that might indicate how it opened. And as his hand moved, he noticed a subtle indentation along one side, smaller than the one above, almost hidden within the design itself. And when his fingers pressed against it, there was a pause, a stillness that seemed to stretch longer than it should have. And then, quietly, almost gently, the top of the box shifted just a fraction of an inch, enough to reveal that it was not sealed shut, only waiting to be opened the right way. And Daniel exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible in the stillness, because in that moment he knew that whatever lay inside was not hidden by accident, and it had not been left behind for just anyone to find. And above him, Rex remained, completely still, watching, listening, as if he had already known that this moment would come, long before Daniel ever stepped into the darkness below. Daniel did not open the box right away, even though every instinct inside him was pulling him forward, urging him to see what had been hidden for so long. Because there was something in the stillness of that room that demanded patience, something that felt less like discovery and more like permission, and he kept his hand resting lightly against the surface, feeling the subtle shift beneath his palm, that faint responsive hum that now felt less like a mystery and more like a presence, quiet but aware. And he drew in a slow breath, steadying himself the way he had learned to do when standing at the edge of something that could not be undone once crossed. And above him Rex let out a single, soft exhale, not a warning, not a call, just a sound that carried a calm certainty, as if the dog understood that this moment had already been decided long before either of them stepped into this place. And Daniel lowered his hand slightly, finding the edge where the lid had shifted, and with careful, deliberate movement, he lifted it just enough to allow a narrow line of light to slip inside. And what met him was not darkness, but a soft reflection, something within catching the beam and returning it in a muted, steady glow, not bright, not harsh, just present. And he opened the lid a little further, the motion smooth now, almost effortless, as if the mechanism had been waiting for that exact touch. And inside the box, resting at its center, was a small device, no larger than the palm of his hand, shaped with clean lines and a simplicity that suggested purpose over design. And its surface carried the same etched symbol as the lid, repeated but more refined, as if this was the true form of whatever the mark represented. And the faint hum he had been hearing all along was stronger here, not louder, but clearer, its rhythm steady, almost like a heartbeat that had been waiting in silence for someone to notice it. And Daniel leaned closer, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied it, not with confusion, but with a growing sense of recognition that did not come from memory alone, but from something deeper, something instinctive. And as he hovered his hand above the device, the hum shifted again, aligning with his movement in a way that was too precise to ignore. And for a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, the air still, the silence deepening around that single point of connection. And Daniel slowly extended his fingers, lowering them toward the surface until they made contact. And the moment they did, the rhythm changed, not abruptly, not sharply, but in a smooth and deliberate way, as if the device had been waiting for that exact moment to respond. And a faint warmth spread beneath his fingertips, subtle but undeniable, carrying with it a sense of activation rather than reaction. And Daniel felt his chest tighten slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of understanding beginning to take shape. Because this was not just something left behind, it was something designed to be found, to be engaged, to be continued. And above him, Rex shifted once more, his ears lifting higher, his body still but alert, as if he could feel the change from where he stood. And Daniel remained there, his hand steady, his breath slow, because in that quiet, hidden room beneath the world he thought he knew, he realized that whatever this was, it had not been waiting for time to pass. It had been waiting for someone to finally listen closely enough to answer. Daniel did not pull his hand away, not immediately, because the moment held something too precise to interrupt, and the warmth beneath his fingertips remained steady, not growing, not fading, just present in a way that felt intentional, and the soft rhythm of the device continued, now fully aligned with his touch, no longer distant or separate, but connected, as if a circuit that had been incomplete for years had finally found its missing piece. And for a long second, nothing else changed. No sudden movement, no burst of light, no dramatic shift, just a quiet continuation, and somehow that made it feel more real, more grounded, as if whatever this was had never been meant to overwhelm, only to be understood. And Daniel slowly lifted his hand, not breaking the connection abruptly, but easing away from it. And as he did, the warmth receded, the rhythm returning to its original pattern, steady and patient, as if acknowledging the contact rather than demanding it. And he exhaled, a slow breath that carried more weight than he expected, because in that moment he realized something that did not need explanation. This was not an ending, it was a beginning. And he reached carefully into the box, not to take the device away, but to examine it more closely, lifting it just slightly from its resting place. And it felt balanced in his hand, neither heavy nor light, as if its weight had been designed to match the one holding it. And the etched symbol caught the edge of the flashlight again, reflecting a soft, steady glimmer that no longer felt unfamiliar. And Daniel turned it slightly, studying its surface, its edges, searching for something that might explain it in terms he could define, but nothing about it offered simple answers. And yet it did not feel confusing. It felt clear in a way that did not rely on words. And above him, Rex let out a quiet breath again, shifting his weight at the opening, his presence unchanged, steady, certain. And Daniel glanced upward, meeting his eyes once more. And in that brief exchange there was no question left, only understanding. Because Rex had not been reacting to something unknown, he had been responding to something real, something that had been there long before either of them arrived. And Daniel carefully placed the device back into the box, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for what it represented. And he closed the lid slowly, the motion smooth and controlled. And as it settled back into place, the faint hum softened slightly, not disappearing, just returning to that quiet, waiting rhythm it had held before. And Daniel stood there for a moment longer, the flashlight steady in his hand, the room unchanged but no longer unfamiliar. And when he finally turned toward the stairway, he moved with a different kind of certainty, not searching anymore, but carrying something he had not known he was missing. And he climbed back up toward the opening, the rope steady beneath his grip. And when he emerged into the cabin, the first light of early morning had begun to touch the edges of the windows, pale and calm. And Rex stepped back to give him space before moving forward again, pressing gently against his side, grounding him in the present. And Daniel rested his hand on the dog's neck, fingers brushing through the fur with quiet gratitude. Because there are moments in life when answers do not arrive as words or explanations, but as something simpler, something quieter. And as he looked down at the floor, now open to what lay beneath, he understood that some signals are not meant to be heard by everyone, only by those willing to listen long enough. And sometimes, the ones who hear them first do not speak at all, but they lead you exactly where you need